So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second session of the summer term 2024 of SunoikisisDC Digital Classics and Byzantine Studies. The topic of today's session is text alignment, and it will be presented by our colleagues Megan Bushnell from the University of London and Chiara Palladino from Furman University. So today we're going to learn, for those who have been following us from the first session, today we're going to learn one of the many things and many approaches that we can do with the open and free primary text that we talked about in our first session this semester. So if you're new here, you can refer to the first session in this semester so that you can have some nice and clean text for your exercises today and in the following sessions. As usual, if you're watching this video live, please say hi and tell us where you're watching from. And of course, feel free to ask questions, make comments, either now or at the end of the session. Having said that, I think that we have so much to say today that I can hand over to our speakers, and I think that Megan is starting, so I will share your screen and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Martina, and hi everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm Megan. I'm a digital scholar and a corpus linguist who investigates primarily the reception of classical texts in the Middle Ages. So that's kind of how I link up to everything here. So today, as Martina said, we're talking to you about text alignment. And I'm going to start us off by just telling you a bit about some basic principles behind text alignment, focusing especially on the theory behind it and the history of this theory. So in brief, text alignment is the comparison of two or more texts to find equivalence between text units. And this is especially useful when analyzing translations, where you can use text alignment to investigate the relationship of the translation with its source, or even compare translations of the same text to evaluate their differences. For example, if we look at these two renditions of the beginning of the Gospel of John, we can see some undeniable parallels, but also some really interesting differences in grammatical structure and word choices, which can be really, really productive to analyze. You can align your text by word, but also by larger structures such as sentences, sections of texts, or even whole documents. For example, here's a Latin rendition of the Hellenicus fragments, which is aligned by word, which you can see works really, really well, yielding a set of translation pairs that are nearly perfectly equivalent to one another, both in terms of meaning and grammatical function. Translation pairs, by the way, are words in a source and translation that are equivalent to one another. For example, if you look at the first word in the Greek, protein, which is linked, its translation, it's paired with primam. That's a translation pair, for example. However, not all texts work this way. Sometimes word-for-word equivalence is not evident. This is especially the case for translation between languages that are grammatically very different, or for loose translations and adaptations that approach their source less forensically. In these cases, you might want to align your text using different units. Now for some theoretical background, though. So translation alignment is a core principle in translation studies, specifically descriptive translation studies, also known as DTS. Now, DTS is a discipline that aims to describe the phenomenon of translating and translations as they manifest themselves in the world of our experience. So it's very much trying to describe what exists and understanding how it exists, rather than trying to set down rules for how translation should be done. And DTS makes three assumptions about translations. First of all, that they're based on a source. Secondly, that they are the result of a transferal process from the source text to the translation. And lastly, that there is a tangible relationship between the translation and the source, which we often refer to as equivalence. Now, the goal in DTS is to reconstruct the translation method for a text by examining equivalence between the translation and the source. And this is what translation alignment is really, really good at doing. Of course, equivalence itself is a bit of a thorny concept. It's widely accepted that perfect linguistic equivalence does not exist. No one lexical item can perfectly match another's denotation, connotation, semantic network, and in the case of poetry, homophonic properties. You generally can't find one word between two languages that can perfectly match in that way. However, cultural equivalence, or words that serve the same cultural function, if not the same linguistic one, those are possible. And it's on this basis that some scholars argue that translation is really a process of cultural transformation. Consequently, text alignment can be used to reverse engineer cultural contexts, which is really exciting. As Gideon Torrey kind of lays out in this diagram here on the right-hand side of the slide, cultural concerns tend to dictate the linguistic realization of a translation, which then selects the appropriate translation strategies for those realizations. So equivalency is generally defined in terms of two principles, acceptability and adequacy. Acceptability describes how well a text meets the target language's cultural standards, whereas adequacy describes how accurately a text corresponds to its source. These two principles might be understood as opposite ends of a continuum, but in reality, it's really not so simple, as in some scenarios, the two might actually overlap. So, for example, it could be that in certain cultural contexts, an acceptable translation is one that prioritizes adequacy as well. I mean, you might even think today of like modern academic translations. They're only really considered good if they are translating the text, very forensically, very accurately, but that they're also managing to communicate in a way that is interesting for us to read. So in my opinion, a better model for kind of understanding these concepts of acceptability and adequacy would be to consider equivalence as a balance between the source language, the target language, and the target language's cultural expectations. So considering them kind of as a triangle with 3 different points. But it's the translator who gets to decide where these points are and what kind of triangle he is drawing, or she, of course. So it's really calibrated based on the translator's own intentions. And again, this means that textual alignment is really, really useful for understanding what those intentions are, and it gives us some interesting insights into what translators are trying to achieve. So I'm going to now give you kind of a quick example of how this kind of calibration can occur by looking at some kind of different formulations of these two principles throughout the ages. These ideas about translation are not new at all. Really, from the time of ancient Rome, there has been a general discussion about how translation should be done, how closely should you be adhering to the text, all that kind of thing. Here we've got 3 quotes, one from Cicero, one from Horace, and one from St. Gregory the Great, all of which are kind of saying the same thing. They're all disavowing this idea of word-for-word translation, saying that, perfect equivalency is impossible and you shouldn't strive for it. However, the really interesting thing about these figures is that they perfectly illustrate the triangular model just raised. For while they all ostensibly claim to follow the same kind of translation, or rather disavow the same kind of translation, there are some crucial differences in how they apply the same non-verbo pro verbo dictum. So this is a little summary table breaking down each translator's approach in terms of whether they translate word for word, whether they prioritize adequacy or acceptability, their goal while translating, and their understanding of the relationship between meaning and language. And you can see that while Cicero and Horace advocate translating sense for sense, well, Cicero, Horace, and Gregory, they both agreed that you should translate sense for sense, but they differ greatly on other points, indicating that equivalence is really a multifaceted issue that can be reinterpreted in many different ways by different translators. I realize that's a bit of a rush through the theory, but I think that's enough for now. We should really start looking at, how do we do textual alignment? I'd say very roughly, there are two general approaches. You can apply text alignment manually by carefully cross-referencing a translation with its source. And this has many benefits in that you have complete control over the process, and it really gives you a first-hand insight into how the translation works. However, of course, it's also extremely laborious and time-consuming, which makes it not a great choice for larger texts. There are also automatic alignment options such as Ugarit, which Chiara can tell you more about since she was part of the team that created it. These are obviously much more faster, they're powerful compared to manual alignment, but they don't necessarily have quite the same flexibility as of yet, though I expect over time they're going to become more and more viable options. Other tools that you might find useful are parallel corpora, which are collections of texts, usually sources and translations that have been aligned to one another. And text alignment really enhances search in these corpora because they enable something called parallel concordancing, the searching for keywords in context across aligned texts in tandem. In other words, you can search for one thing in, either your translation or source, and then you will see the equivalent results come up for the other connected text. And this is really, really helpful for more advanced linguistic analysis, where you might want to look for things like collocates or grammatical structures and track how these are reflected in the aligned text. For example, if you're interested in epithets, for example, in an epic poem, you might want to be able to search for those epithets, maybe search for collocates in the source, and then be able to very quickly cross-reference how those have been represented in a translation to see if the translator always translates them the same way or if there's some variation, and how they handle that really, really kind of interesting phenomenon that's so common in epic poetry. A prime example of a parallel corpus is the Bible corpus, which contains 1,169 unique translations of the Bible, and I think is something that has been recommended for you to check out as a potential source for the exercise that we're going to ask you to do. But yeah, it's a really amazing resource. Now, when you align your text, whether you're doing it manually or automatically, you're bound to encounter a few challenges. One of them is, of course, crossing dependencies, where there is a different word order or a sentence order. You'll also find that there is often content that doesn't really have an equivalent or isn't completely equivalent, or maybe has an equivalence that's shared across different words. In other words, things just sometimes get messy, and it can be sometimes hard to perfectly assign translation pairs. That's always part of the challenge, and it's a bit of a subjective call on your part from time to time. You might also encounter figures of speech that linguistically are not equivalent to the source, but culturally are. And that's going to require that you're not only linguistically proficient when you're aligning text, but that you have a really good understanding of the context of your text and what you're dealing with. It's a really, really rich discipline to engage with, but it sometimes can be complicated, but that's also what makes it interesting. Here are a few useful resources that I've kind of referenced in these slides if you'd like to learn more about these topics. I particularly recommend Gideon Torrey's book, Descriptive Translation Studies and Beyond, which offers a really, really great introduction to these issues and is available online. By the way, that's enough of the theory and the background. Now I want to kind of present to you a case study of how you might consider aligning your texts. Chiara is going to present after me a case study about aligning word by word, but I'm going to show you what happens if you align line by line. And it's really crucial that no matter which way you go about it, both approaches are perfectly valid, but it's crucial that you always have a sense of there's always a rationale behind your decision in how you approach alignment, because it can have a huge impact on your results. So we're now going to look quite briefly at my own work on the Enneados as an example of a line-by-line alignment. So the Enneados is the first full direct translation of the Aeneid in the British Isles. It's actually a Scottish translation, which explains why not that many people really know about it. But it was translated by Gavin Douglas, who is a Scottish cleric and who later became a Catholic bishop. It's a really fascinating translation because before this translation, there were lots of indirect translations and adaptations via prose of the Aeneid. But this text really breaks the mold in that it's almost modern in its commitment to accurately translating the text. It was translated into Older Scots, which is a language very, very similar to Middle English, but with some different lexical items. One of the most interesting things about this poem is that Gavin Douglas, the translator, he doesn't just translate the poem, he also adds in a lot of original content as he adds prologues to each of the books, where he provides a lot of commentary on his translation and his thoughts about translation and his whole kind of translation process. And one of the most interesting statements he makes is that he doesn't translate word for word. However, as we've kind of seen in our previous really brief discussion of Cicero, Horace, and Gregory, it's unclear what exactly he means by this. And it's unclear even if he's being totally honest here, because by this point, in 1513, the words of Cicero and certainly of Gregory the Great were so enshrined when it came to translation that it was almost kind of an expected thing for any translator to go, oh, I don't translate word for word. The authorities tell us not to. So it's a real question about how does he actually translate. So to investigate this text, I created digital versions of the text and its source, and I aligned them by line. And I did this all manually using a tool called AntPconc to enable parallel concordancing. And then I later used something called CQP-Web, which is a really powerful platform for corpus linguistics. So as part of this method, I defined a translation unit as whole lines of the source and translation that correspond to one another completely, and that cannot be broken down into smaller units contained within whole lines. And then from each of these translation units, I would then extract a line ratio, which is a measure of how many Scottish lines were used to translate one Latin line per unit. So I then fitted these line ratios to a statistical model to test if there were strong trends in line ratios across the translation as a means of evaluating exactly how Gavin Douglas is translating and when he adds original content, where this original content is being added. But of course, the big question for us here is why I decided to align the text by line. I mean, a big consideration here was, of course, the fact that Douglas claimed that he didn't translate word by word. So word alignment seemed inappropriate. Not to mention the fact that there is a lot of content in Douglas's translation that doesn't always have equivalent material in the source, such as the little filler clause from every stead that's in that example down at the bottom of the slide that's bolded in black. These pose a bit of a challenge for aligning by word that aligning by line neatly avoids. In addition, the line is an established poetic unit that we could confidently assume Douglas would have some respect for, especially since he makes such a big point about criticizing other translators for translating the Aeneid into prose rather than into poetry. However, if I'm to be fully honest, perhaps the biggest consideration in approaching my text by line was the fact that the tool I used, AmpyConc, works best on lines. And that was the tool that I first started experimenting with. Luckily, this worked out well for me, but it raises a really important point that it's good to be aware of the kind of methodological assumptions your tools make. And it's worth keeping this in mind as you use them and always evaluating, like, is this sort of method the right one for this content? But as I said, aligning by line worked really well for this text, and we got a lot of really great findings from it. So one of the biggest findings was that line ratios significantly increase over the course of the poem, indicating a kind of evolving mode of translation. We kind of got the sense really that Douglas kind of was learning as he went along, which has some really, really interesting ramifications when you think about it. Because for one thing, it suggests that he translated the Aeneid in book order, which is rather unusual because that's not how it was read at the time. People would usually they'd read maybe book 1, but more likely they'd focus on books 2 and 4, because, you know, those are the big Troy books, and then you've got the book about Dido. You know, those are the most popular ones. And then they wouldn't really bother with a lot of the later books, or they'd pick and choose, you know, famous passages from the poem rather than read the whole thing through. It also suggests that Douglas really didn't revise his translation, that he kind of went through it once and then that was it. He didn't do anything to even out his translation later. And this tallies with what we know about how long it took for him to write the translation, because he said he did it in about, I think, 15 months, I think, or something along those lines. He certainly did it very, very quickly, so you can easily imagine that he didn't really go back and revise later. The fact that the line alignment works so well is also proof that Douglas really did attach special significance to Virgil's lines as a poetic structure. We also see that he attaches similar importance to other layout structures in the poem as well. And we see this especially in sometimes there are some awkward translations that we have found have been motivated by page breaks, actually, that he was kind of taking as markers of meaning. And it seems likely, actually, that Douglas's changing translation mode was motivated in part by the changing layout of his source text, which it was impacting how he was reading and translating the poem. Finally, by mapping out the line ratios in this way, I was able to create a map, a really useful guide really to see where Douglas adds material and where he doesn't. And from this, we can tell that he has a tendency to add material to moments of ekphrasis and non-lethal combat, which he kind of uses as showpieces for his own poetic skill. So there he likes to kind of depart from the text a bit and add a bit of his own spice. By contrast, he tends to under-translate speeches by Roman gods and moments of extreme violence, providing evidence of some discomfort with non-Christian gods, which we kind of might expect from a future Catholic bishop, and also discomfort with death and violence. So in this way, Douglas sometimes seems to use his translation method to kind of artfully censor aspects of his source that he finds a bit uncomfortable. So that all worked really well, but what questions might a word alignment approach have answered? I think the biggest one is we still don't necessarily have a clear answer to the question, does Douglas translate word by word? We know that he structures his poem around lines, but we can also see, well, I can also see from manually aligning the whole thing, that his translation is also really careful to follow the lexis as well. It's really, really detailed. It's practically forensic. We still don't necessarily know from the study that I've done how well a word alignment model would fit. So that's something that a different approach might have helped answer. The line alignment model is also not the most useful for producing lexical translation pairs, as you'd still have to pick these out manually from translation units designed around lines. This means that we still don't have a comprehensive means of analyzing translation pairs across the entirety of the poem, which also means we can't answer some questions about lexical patterns within the translation and what these might be responding to. All this, I hope, kind of helps to demonstrate that how you align your text has a big impact on the kind of results that you get. Here's an example of different alignment outcomes for just this single translation unit. Now, as you can see here, we've got one line of the Latin that Douglas translates with 4 lines of Scots, which gives us a line ratio of 4. However, if we aligned by sentences instead, we'd get a ratio of 1.5. And if we aligned by word, you get 4.4. So these are different results and maybe suggest different things. The 1.5 ratio for sentences is quite interesting because it suggests that Douglas was also maybe paying attention to grammar and how the sentences are broken up in his source text, which would be something really interesting to investigate. However, at the same time, it also isn't as useful for tracking, where Douglas is adding material and where is he sticking close to the text. Similarly, if we look at bigger alignment units, we see very different results. For example, Douglas's source text tends to break the Aeneid up into smaller episodes. And Douglas then uses these smaller episodes and sort of groups them together into larger chapters, which results in this very, very small ratio of 0.4. This is really useful for any analysis of how Douglas interprets the layout of his source. But aligning the text in chunks this big makes it harder to do more detailed lexical analysis. So again, it really depends on what you're interested in looking at, and also, what is in your text and what suits your text the most. That's the end of my case study. I'm just going to finish up really briefly by giving you guys a quick look at the tool I used called AntPconc. But if you have any further questions about my work on Gavin Douglas and the Ennios, please do get in touch. I'd be really happy to talk more about it. But I don't want to keep us waiting too long. So without further ado, AntPconc. So AntPconc is part of the AntConc family, which is a suite of corpus linguistic tools created by Lawrence Anthony. It's a freeware concordancer, meaning that it's free to download and use. And it's used primarily to search text and to generate some basic statistics about word frequency and tagging. AntConc tools are considered the bread and butter of corpus linguistics. They're really easy to use and they're quite powerful for what they are. They're not necessarily the most sophisticated tools, but they are really useful when you're just getting started. AntPconc is a parallel concordancer, meaning it's able to search aligned texts in tandem. So AntPconc is sadly not as developed as the other AntConc tools, so it has some really limited uses. It's very easy to download and use and provides instant access to parallel concordancing. However, at the same time, it has some limited functionality. Its method of alignment is not very sophisticated, and it can make text quite hard to read. Its results are also not immediately shareable to others, so you can't always show people in real time what you've been working on. Consequently, I generally recommend AntPconc predominantly as a sandbox for when you are building your own parallel corpus or when you're experimenting with different forms of alignment. I'd say it's definitely a good place to begin, but you'll probably want to use something more sophisticated as your research develops. I'm just going to show you some screenshots to kind of help demonstrate to you how the software works. So the first thing you want to do when you use AntPconc is obviously you will want to download it. So you'll want to go to this website, lawrenceanthony.net, which hosts all of the AntConc software. And then you want to select on the menu, software, this bit in purple. When you do that, there will be a drop-down menu that lists all of the tools that Lawrence Anthony has created, and there's so much. But obviously you'd want to select AmpPconc. And that will take you to the AmpPconc homepage, where you can see there are loads of download options in terms of how you can access the text, in terms of which operating system you use, that is. So just select the appropriate option for you, and the software should immediately download. Once you've downloaded it, you can open it from your downloads folder, and then you'll see this window. This is what the AmpPconc software looks like. As you can see, you can search for specific queries. There's a little search box for that within your corpus. You have some flexibility in sort of how your results are sorted, and you can search for words, or you can search in terms of case as well. However, before you get to do any of that, you first have to build your corpus within AmpPconc. And to do that, you would go to File, then select Build/Edit Corpus. And then this little window will appear called Corpus Builder. Once you're in that window, all you have to do is click Add Corpus. When you do that, then this window will pop up, and it will say Corpus 1. So you need to then name your corpus. I've named my first one Source. And then you have to choose your files. Then you do the same to create your second parallel corpus. You would click Add Corpus, name your corpus. I've named mine Translation. And then you would choose your files again. In terms of the files that you choose, AmpPconc again has limited capabilities. It can only really handle text files at the moment. So those are the ones you have to use. And if you are dealing with multiple files, well, let me backtrack for a moment there. I would say, so the way AmpPconc works in terms of alignment is that you would have one text file that's your source, then another text file that's your translation. You'd upload your source file in the source corpus, your translation file in the translation corpus. If you have multiple files for each, you have to make sure that you upload them in the same order for each corpus. So for example, I have 13 books of the Enneados. I have to make sure that they are loaded in the same order as, the 12 books of the Aeneid plus an extra supplement that the translation is based on. Those have to be all listed in the same order so that AmpPconc can easily cross-reference them. The actual alignment process is all manually done within your text file. These are my text files for the Aeneid Book 1 and the Enneados Book 1. And they are aligned in such a way that you put all equivalent content on the same row across the two text files. So as you can see here, looking at these first line, this is basically saying that lines 1, 2, and 3 in the Latin is equivalent to lines 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the Scots. And they're all put on the same row to signal to AmpPconc that these are equivalent. When you're doing this, it can be very easy to lose track. It can be quite cumbersome. The best way to kind of try and make sure that everything is where it should be is by aligning things up like this, so you can easily see that things are on the same row by line. Estimating it by eye. I would also really recommend that you disable word wrap in your text editor to make sure that you don't have that confusing things. But once you've done that, this is the result. You can then do parallel concordancing. So on the left-hand example, I searched my translation for any instance of Aeneid, which is the Scottish form of Aeneas. And then the results on top are all of the Scottish instances of this. And then the results on bottom are all of the equivalent lines in Latin. So we can easily see, you know, where Aeneas is standing in for Ennius and so on. However, you can also do this the other way. You can search the source. So I searched the source text for the word Pius, as in like Pius Aeneas. And then you see the top results are all in Latin. The bottom results are all the equivalent ones in Scots. So we can observe how the translator has interpreted this epithet for Aeneas. Anyway, I won't go on any longer. I'll now turn over to Chiara so she can show you word by word alignment. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so my name is Chiara Palladino. Welcome, everybody. If you don't know me, I am an assistant professor of classics at Furman University, and I'm joining this SunoikisisDC session as a member of the Ugarit project, essentially. So I'm going to illustrate what we do in terms of text alignment and translation alignment with Ugarit, and I'm going to focus on the task that Ugarit was designed for, which is alignment word by word. So I'm actually going to propose a case study in the spirit of Megan's excellent example and introduction, which is a little different. Again, we started thinking about what we could use different types of alignment for. And Megan gave us an excellent option to discover the usefulness of line-by-line alignment. I'm actually going to focus on word by word. And the case that I'm going to propose is using word by word alignment for the evaluation of different competing translations. So we're working on 4 different translations in the same language of a work in ancient Greek. And in our case, this work is the tragedy by Euripides called Hippolytus. We selected 4 English translations, all relatively modern, and we selected 2 different particularly interesting bits of Hippolytus. The prologue, which, if you don't know the tragedy, is held by the goddess Aphrodite, and one of the 2 monologues by Hippolytus, which specifically is a misogynistic, anti-women tirade. And I'm saying this because it's relevant to what we're going to say next. Before I go further with this slide, I actually want to go a little bit more into the methodology that we used. As we said, word-by-word alignment consists in the establishment of equivalences that have a very, very fine level of granularity. So we're talking about single words, or at the highest level, we're talking about phrases. But we're definitely not taking big chunks of text. And so this comes with its own challenges. The tool that we use is Ugarit. And this is an open source tool. You can access it. You just need to create a profile. We don't retain any data. And it is designed as a crowdsourcing application for a translation alignment that happens manually. So you can design your own translation alignments and set up your own guidelines, set up your text. And Ugarit was designed with low resource languages in mind, so specifically ancient and historical languages, and in general, underrepresented languages in the digital humanities environment. Ugarit was a team effort. It started in 2016. These are just some of the people that supported the project in various capacities. We inaugurated with the support of the Humboldt Chair of Digital Humanities in Leipzig. And since then, we have expanded and we're still active with our general idea of providing a platform for people to do translation alignment in low resource languages. Originally, the goal was relatively narrow. We wanted essentially to use the resulting parallel text to improve training data for statistical alignment models. So we wanted to figure out a way to collect training data to perform this kind of task manually. But then we expanded the user base and also the applications quite enormously since then. And we have discovered some new opportunities and some new ways of making this work. So right now, Ugarit serves several different purposes. Definitely the core task is still word-by-word alignment. It provides a platform for you to create, share, and publish your alignment data. It provides a pretty nice reading environment, which I'm going to show you in a minute. It gives you the option, which we did, of downloading all of the alignments in the form of translation pairs, that is each equivalence that you have established, share them in different platforms and do things with them. Of course, create different kinds of statistic visualizations. And it also enables you to collect those translation pairs as training data. And in 2022, we actually also succeeded in turning this into an automatic tool. So the translation pairs that were designed by our users on Ugarit were used to feed an automatic AI-based translation alignment model that currently works pretty well on ancient Greek and a variety of modern languages of translation. So you can actually perform automatic word-by-word alignment using this platform, and I invite you to test it out and see what it can do for you. The general purpose of doing this is, of course, to streamline the, as Megan said, the extremely time-consuming and potentially inconsistent work of having to do this manually by yourself. But as we will see, there are limits. There are limitations to this, and there are things that can just be established manually by an expert when a specific research question is being asked. So without further ado, I'm going to illustrate the Ugarit tool for you before I get in depth in the case study and illustrate what our findings were. This is also one of the tools that you may have to use for the exercise. So again, I invite you to go to the link and follow along with me if you can. Create a profile and log in so that you can test it out and see how it works for yourselves. So Ugarit is pretty straightforward in terms of the workflow if you want to create your own translation alignment. So you just go to Ugarit, you create an account, you will need your full name, an email. You don't have to fill in an organization, but you also have to put in a username. You can put a pseudonym or whatever you want, or just your first name and last name, and a password, of course. Once you're in, you log into the platform, of course, and then you select the option that says Translation Alignment Editor. This is the option that will help you create an alignment. And you can select two different types of translation alignment. One is what we call the bilingual translation alignment, or you can even align 3 different languages. So you can work with 2 texts or 3 texts, depending on what you're doing, depending on what your research question is. So once you get here, what you do is simply copy and paste your source text and your translation in the 2 little boxes that you can see on the left and the right, respectively. As a general rule, we recommend that you place your source text on the left and you place whatever translation you have on the right. You should select the language. Please do it and do it correctly. We have a very big drop-down list of options for you, so your language should be in there. If you're working with something that you don't see represented in Ugarit, please write to us and we will add it for you. Once you're here, you just click on Align, regardless of whether you're working with 3 texts or 1 text. And what happens is that you get redirected to the Translation Alignment Editor. The first thing that you may want to do is to add some metadata for your text, just to be able to find it again. You should add a title. You should add the name of the translator, if possible, a description. You can also re-edit the languages if you want. And there's an option for you to make your translation alignment visible or not. If you leave the default option, which is yes, you're going to be able to see that published on the Ugarit platform right away. If you click no, it's not going to be visible to anyone. And this is particularly useful if you're working on an in-progress project or an assignment or something that you just don't want people to see. And then after that, the workflow is extremely simple. You just click on the word or words on the source text that you want to align, and then you click on the corresponding or equivalent words in the translation text on the right. As you click and you move forward, you're going to be able to see that Ugarit creates your preview of the translation pairs on the right. You're able to align word to word, or phrase to phrase, or phrase to word, or word to phrase. So there's no limit to the number of words that you can align in principle. Once you're done, you save the changes with a little blue button that you see in the center of the screen. And you're going to be able to see a preview of the reading environment in Ugarit, which looks like this. And it also offers you a few additional pieces of information that you may find it interesting to investigate if you're doing this for a specific research question or for a specific project. As you can see in the reading environment, when you hover with your mouse on a specific word, what happens is that it activates the alignment that you have established. And so both the equivalent words are going to be highlighted in red. We also have a transliteration function for non-Latin alphabets. So you're going to be able to see a transliteration of every word if you're working with ancient Greek or Arabic or Persian. You also get a very nice sort of distant preview of how your alignment looks like globally. In blue are all of the aligned tokens. As you can see here, in red, there are the non-aligned tokens. So everything that you have left out from your alignment. And as you can see, there is also a progress bar below each of your alignments that tells you the percentage of tokens that have been aligned or not. This is not necessarily going to be filled up to 100%, because that almost never happens. It's just a measure of the number of things that you have aligned on your own. You can also embed the translation into your website or whatever you want. You can embed all of it or just specific sections of it. You can have a preview and download all of the translation pairs that you created. And it also gives you access to some statistics right away. So for example, one of the most useful is the alignment statistic by link type. So it's going to show you the number of times that you have aligned one word to one word to many, many to many, and many to one. If you click on a single word, you're also going to be able to activate the integrated dynamic lexicon, which is basically a tool that fetches all of the translation equivalents established for that particular word across the entire Ugarit database. So this is not just the equivalents that you have established, is what everybody else on Ugarit has established for the same word. And you can see that visualized as a list or as a radial cluster dendrogram, which is the thing that you can see on the right, and it's just a tree view. So evidently, even if you just have access to a simple preview of your alignment, you're going to be able to see some things right away. If you have done your work right, you can see evidently when there is some closeness or some good level of overlap between the original and translation. You can see at a glance what kinds of words have been left out in the alignment. You can get a measure of omission or expansion across the different alignments. And this, of course, becomes really, really useful if you're working across different translations, because you can start making comparisons across them. And this is actually what we did. We tried to experiment with this methodology by selecting 4 different competing, so to speak, translations. And we decided to figure out what would happen if we picked translations that were all relatively modern, but also relatively different from one another. So we picked the Cambridge translation by Kovacs, which is a very scholarly translation. It's in prose. Hippolytus is a tragedy, so it's in poetry. We picked the Theodoridis one, which is an open access translation, which is developed as a theatrical script. The translation by Ian Johnston, which is also available online, and it's designed for school and general audiences, and it's the only one that's in poetry. And then Coleridge's translation, which is the oldest one, as you can see, from 1910, which was a commissioned translation. And it was, by the words of its author, designed to be the most accurate translation in prose of the Hippolytus. And we're going to see if that's true. Our methodology was essentially a mixture between scholarly annotation, manual work of establishment of equivalences across languages, and some quantitative criteria that we tried to figure out in terms of what could be useful to investigate the relationship between these translations and the original. So we designed our manual alignments. And one thing that I will say about this process is that there is a huge potential limitation in applying this methodology, both when you're doing it manually and automatically, in the establishment of a consistent alignment strategy. You have to be consistent and you have to establish very specific guidelines. Otherwise, that's going to affect your findings and it's going to affect the entire result of your investigation. We were lucky enough that we could use existing guidelines that had been tested for consistency and are also available online, evidently open access. And we adapted those guidelines, which were designed for model training, for our specific research purposes. Essentially, what we did was to increase the tolerance for phrasal alignments, because we were interested in figuring out, for example, how a specific fixed expression or proverbial or phrasal expression would be translated across different works. So we wanted to go beyond the simple one word to one word alignment link. So we did this combining different types of investigations and different types of criteria. And what I'm going to show you is some preliminary insight into what we did, our findings, just as a case study of what can be done with a method like translation alignment, word by word. So we started by establishing certain quantitative metrics. The first thing that we did was create our corpus. We created our corpus. We aligned each text against each of the 4 English translations. We extracted the data, and we decided to manipulate them in different ways. We considered all of these indicators. We decided to measure the rate of aligned words and non-aligned words. We decided to measure the intersection, so the word intersection across translations. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The frequency of the link types, which is the little statistics that I showed you before, equivalences across part of speech, and intersection across part of speech. So in other words, if the 4 translations used the same part of speech to translate certain things in the Greek or not. We didn't use each of these indicators separately, but we tried to combine them to achieve a more thoughtful set of findings. And we also added some semantic information from the manual annotation of the data, because every time we would get a sort of a quantitative result from each element of this analysis, we would also combine it with close reading and individual results from our annotations. So let's talk about lack of alignment first. One of the things that we decided to do, and this was specifically because we had full control on the way in which our dataset was created, was to investigate the occurrences of lack of alignment. And lack of alignment goes both ways, right? It's non-aligned words in the translation or non-aligned words in the original. So in the third column, you can also see the length rate between the source language, language 1, and the translation language 2, which is also a useful indicator to combine with lack of alignment, sorry. So the lack of alignment in Greek or in English, respectively, is an indicator of different things. If many words are not aligned in the Greek, so they're missing from the English translation, that may indicate that there's a tendency to omission. If many words are not aligned in the English, that is, they do not find an equivalence in the original, this may indicate that the English translation has a tendency towards expansion. And as you can see, The rate of non-aligned words in Greek is relatively equally spread across the 4 competing translations. It goes between 7% at the lowest end in Coleridge, and 15%, 16% at the highest end in Theodoridis. And I will come back to Theodoridis and why that happens. Conversely, the rate of non-aligned tokens in English, which you can see also in the chart in red, has a much wider span. It goes from Coleridge, which is about 5%, and it keeps up to Theodoridis at 31%, which is staggering. It means that there is at least a third of words in English in Theodoridis that did not find a suitable correspondence in ancient Greek. So this is kind of interesting, and it can also be seen visually if you just look at the translation alignments of Coleridge and Theodoridis. As you can see in Coleridge, there is very little that hasn't been aligned except for the punctuation. Specifically in English, there is only one relevant actual word, which is the husband. And in Greek, there are only a couple of specific relevant concepts, brotus, which is the morals, and kakisto, which is the superlative for bad, the worst. A little down the line. So there is definitely a tendency in Coleridge to have quite a close overlap. If we look at Theodoridis, the visual impact is very, very different. The other thing that is telling, that is, as I was saying, complementary to this sort of observation, is the length rate. So in general, we can expect that there is a length rate of 0.5, 0.6, sometimes between the original and translation. And this is expected because this essentially means that when Greek uses one word, a translation in English would use 2 or more words. But this is expected because Greek is an inflected language. Ancient Greek is an inflected language, and it tends to have more concisiveness in the way in which it expresses relationships between words and concepts, whereas English tends to use more words because it is a low inflected language. But Theodoridis, again, uses even more words because the rate is almost 0.4, which means that he's going to use at least 2 words, but mostly tending to 3 words whenever Greek uses 1 word. So again, what this means is there is a tendency towards expansion that is very, very considerable in Theodoridis. We also combine this with a consideration of which parts of speech were not aligned. So what was the tendency here was the lack of alignment an indication of something relevant, as I was saying, or is it just limited to, particles and conjunctions and things like that, which are notoriously much more difficult to translate into English. And our findings were largely consistent with this view. So in Greek, mostly particles and conjunctions were omitted. And you can see that in the chart on the left. You can see that particles is way higher than everything else. And it is also pretty evenly spread across our 4 translations. But if you look at the chart on the right, which is the non-aligned words in English, classified by part of speech, there is definitely a tendency here in the addition of specific words, and Theodoridis seems to use the vast majority of added words without any regard for the specific part of speech. So this is a tendency that goes across the board, and it cannot be explained with simply, functional additions, like I don't know, a pronoun or a particle or a conjunction or a little adverb. This is all across the board. Sometimes Theodoridis even adds proper nouns. So this can also be explained slightly with Theodoridis, considering that his translation is very specific in genre. This translation is very different from the other ones because it was designed as a script for theater. It was designed as something that could be put in on the scene as opposed to something that could be read. And this evidently created definitely something more along the lines of an adaptation than a word-by-word translation. Intersection data is something else that we wanted to measure. Essentially, we extracted all of the intersections where the same Greek word or phrase could be compared across all of our translators. So I don't know, if the Greek had one specific word like gyne, we were able to extract all of the corresponding aligned tokens across our 4 translations and to measure the rate of overlap across all of them. It's probably not surprising that across all the 4 translations, we have very, very minimal intersection. In other words, each of the 4 translators uses completely different words to translate the same Greek words. We normalized the results a little bit, and so we achieved a 12% of total overlap, but evidently this means that there is very, very little in common, lexically speaking, across our 4 translators. Generally, we were able to figure out through close reading that there was very little intersection across some specific types of words. And most specifically, we found that there was very little agreement across things like idiomatic expressions. For instance, there is one specific expression which is very, very important to the language of tragedy, which is echeidananke, which means there is the necessity, but it has a kind of a fate or destiny type of implication, which is translated in 4 completely different ways across the board in our 4 translations. And there are also certain words where our translators definitely go out of their way to provide synonyms. One of the most surprising ones was kakon, which is tokakon, is the evil in Greek, which is used repeatedly in these 2 sections in Hippolytus, particularly in the monologue about women, and it's used as a signpost for woman. And we found that this was by far the word with the lowest intersection across the translations, and there were so many possible equivalences across our 4, including curse, evil, bane, problem, plague, trouble, unbearable burden, mischief, worthless, and brainless figurine. This was Johnston. So there's definitely a tendency going on here in which words are specifically chosen for a different kind of translation. And again, in terms of general intersection rate, it's probably not super surprising that the highest intersection rate overall is between Kovacs and Johnston, the 2 more modern, slightly more philological translations in our 4, and that the lowest overlap is, of course, between Theodoridis and everybody else, for the reasons that I said before. So there are definitely lexical conscious choices at work here across the board. Finally, and I'm just going to say a couple of things about this, the link types. The link type is essentially the frequency according to which we established a word-to-word, one word-to-one word link type, or one-to-many, many-to-one, or many-to-many. And this is particularly useful when you want to measure the rate of phrasal alignment, which sometimes is important to indicate presence of idiomatic expressions or presence of particularly poignant language. In combination with everything else that we did, we were able to assess a couple of things here. So for example, here you can see the general tendency. These are all the link types that we measured in the chart on the right. What the chart shows you is basically that there is a good rate of word-to-word alignment. So oftentimes when we have one word in Greek, the translator does its best to align it with one word. But there is also a very, very specific tendency of using multiple words in phrases. And this is particularly true for Theodoridis, who uses that sort of link type in the 60% of the cases, with Johnston being a close second. It's also interesting that Coleridge is the one with the lowest one-to-many rate and with the highest one-to-one link type across the board. And initially we thought that this was counterintuitive, because Coleridge shows very distinct patterns of overlap. For example, his language doesn't overlap with a lot of the others, mostly with Kovacs, but most of that overlap is just about functional words, and it doesn't seem to be particularly interesting across the board in terms of intersection. But he also has the lowest rate of lack of alignment. So as I showed you before, Coleridge tends to have a very, very high rate of overlap with the Greek, and also this. So he tends to have a highest one-to-one ratio as opposed to everybody else. He also tends to have the highest rate of overlap in part of speech. So whenever the Greek uses a certain part of speech, Coleridge tends to use the same part of speech. This is kind of interesting, because what this means is that Coleridge has a pretty good overlap with the Greek, not a lot of overlap with the rest of the English translations. And this is probably due to the lexical peculiarity and to the age of this translation, because he has a very high overlap with the original. So this is not a particularly expansive translation. It's not a translation that omits a lot of things, but it's also a translation from 1910. So evidently, there is a reason why there isn't a lot of overlap with the rest, and that is not because Coleridge is, so to speak, an unfaithful translator. It's because he tends to be very, very peculiar in the choice of the words. On the other hand, the rate of lack of alignment and the rate of one-to-one alignment shows us that he's also the closest to the Greek across the board, even more than Kovacs, who is one of the most authoritative translators of Hippolytus to this day. So after all, what Coleridge declares in his preface to the translation of Hippolytus seems to be true. He wanted to be as close as possible to the original Greek in his translation. So to conclude on this, what I want to say is that what we tried to do here was to apply a combination of factors and a combination of criteria in order to be able to see some tendencies in our competing translations. And we tried to combine that with close reading as well, because whenever you do this, it's always very important to go back to the text and figure out why certain things are happening. Just by judging from the numbers here, we wouldn't be able to achieve some of the conclusions that I mentioned here early on. So it is very, very important when you're doing word-to-word alignment to compare that with what you did when you put together your data set. And this is also very, very important to sort of limit the amount of problems and the amounts of inconsistencies that you can encounter across on the way. One of the most important limitations of using word-to-word alignment, and in general text alignment, is that there is a very strong danger of being inconsistent, because after all, it's one scholar or two scholars establishing word equivalences, but their decisions are their decisions. They are, to a certain extent, arbitrary. And so it's extremely, extremely important to find a way to keep consistency and to define a set of guidelines ahead of time prior to starting the project. And this is, of course, an iterative process. You start with defining alignment guidelines according to your specific research question, but it's always good practice to go back and figure out if you've been missing something or if something is still particularly inconsistent. And as Megan was saying before in her introduction, this is always going to be challenging work, regardless of whether you use an automatic tool or just manual alignment, because alignment doesn't mean perfect equivalence. After all, that's the reason why we're here. Alignment is almost never perfect overlap across words. And then finally, there are, I would say, infrastructure limitations. And this is due to the fact that we're working with low resource languages. We were able to do all of this because we already had suitable guidelines that we could adapt, and we did have some infrastructure to do some NLP work, specifically the part of speech tagging analysis. This is not the case for many low resource languages, and so that combination of factors that I showed you early on may not be possible in specific language pairs. And then without further ado, I will spend the next 2 minutes, hopefully just 2 minutes, explaining the exercise. As Martina mentioned in the introduction to the session, we have proposed 2 options for you to see if you are able to apply these methodologies line by line and word by word alignment to a corpus of your choice. So this is going to be your assignment if you're participating in the session. So we designed the 2 options to be low stakes and high stakes respectively. So option 1 is a little bit more accessible to everyone. Option 2 is a little bit more advanced. And you can find both of these prompts and the questions in the overview of the session for today. So option 1 is just testing out the 2 methodologies and see what they can do for you, essentially. You can select a portion of a text of your choice. I'd recommend working with 2 different languages as opposed to 3, because that's a little bit more manageable. And we have provided a set of corpora and libraries that you can use to do this sort of work. But you can also use your own corpus, your own texts. Then you can use ant-conc to align the text at chunk level. Again, we do recommend that you ideally use sentence or line as your unit of alignment, because that makes things a little bit more interesting. And after you have completed your chunk alignment, you can use Ugarit to align the same corpus at word level. You can also test the automatic alignment tool to see how that works for you. And once you have finished, just observe the results that you obtained in the 2 different aligned data sets and think about what they did for you and what sort of different understanding of the text and the translation they allowed. We have indicated a few questions that you can consider. So for example, what can each type of alignment tell you about the relationship between the 2 texts? What aspects about the 2 texts did the alignment reveal or hinder? Because that's also an option. What kinds of decisions did you have to make to overcome the imperfect equivalences between the sentences or the words? Again, alignment is almost never perfect. So how did you establish that there was sufficient equivalence or overlap across 2 different text units? How did you keep consistency? What kinds of guidelines did you have to establish ahead of time? And then finally, what kinds of observations can you make? What aspects of the relationship between the 2 texts or the 2 languages can you emphasize and can you investigate as you work on the 2 different kinds of alignments? And then the advanced option for you is, again, this is something that you can do by choice. It's not required, but if you want to test it out, you can use the 2 different kinds of alignments that we provided, the 2 different methods that we provided to evaluate 2 or more competing translations. So this requires a little bit more work, and it's a little bit more lengthy in terms of a project, because you will have to perform the same alignment multiple times with 2 or more different texts, and ideally, you would also have to be consistent. So you would need to establish very, very careful and very consistent guidelines for your project. But you can do that using ant-conc or using Ugarit. Choose 2 different translations of the same text, align them line by line, sentence by sentence, or word by word. And once you have finished, you can try and evaluate how the translations mapped onto the original text. And we have provided some sample questions for you. So for example, what can the alignment tell you about the performance of an individual translation? How does it help capturing situations of expansion or omission? How did each translation map onto the original morphologically, syntactically, or lexically? And finally, just thinking a little bit about what constitutes a faithful or a good translation according to you, and according to your particular purposes and research questions. We are at your disposal for any questions that you may have. And at this point, I think I can leave the stage to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, both to Chiara and Megan. This was very, very interesting. And I think we still have like 10 to 15 minutes for some questions that students and participants may have. And I already see that there's one in the comments that will show right now. Are the omission figures given so far inclusive of punctuation? Is punctuation typically counted as separate items for alignment? And I guess this is for Chiara.
Yes. No, we did not include punctuation in our estimates. Ugarit, the tool in the visualization that it provides, it will give you punctuation. It will include punctuation in the estimates, but we excluded that from our analysis. And I have a lengthier answer as to why we did that, but we can maybe put that. We can do that in a different time, or if you're interested, just write in the chat and I can provide that answer.
Thank you so much. May I use my stance as a chairperson to ask a question? I find what you both do and did very, very interesting, but as you know, I work with way smaller texts. I work with usually with seals, so we have we have a lot of items with very small texts on each of them. So it would be very interesting, though, to have to try some translation alignment, also because in the most cases these texts are somehow repetitive. For example, you have some formulae, for example, or on the other hand, you have the extreme opposite, where you have poems on seals with meter and dodecasyllables, so with things that are really unpredictable and not formulaic at all. So would it be possible to use either Ampicom or Ugarit to align many small texts as opposed to one big text? Like, is it feasible? Would the results be doable? And I mean, I haven't tried it yet because I wasn't sure that this would be feasible.
Megan, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd say you could definitely do that in AmpPconc. You can have multiple files in there. You just have to be careful in how you load them in to make sure it doesn't get confused. But I could see that working really well. It's because it would allow you to see everything kind of all at once. So even though you're not dealing with a very large text, you'd be able to essentially treat them like a corpus itself. The only downside, as I've brought up again with AmpPconc, is that especially when you compare it to Ugarit, which has all of these amazing sort of stats built in, AmpPconc has none of that. So it would allow you to read them in a different way and read them collectively, which I think could be quite useful. But if you want to then sort of do distant reading with it and do some statistical analysis with it, that would have to be kind of manually done. So it's not necessarily the perfect tool for that, but it could definitely get you started and give you some ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will say more. We can do that for you, because Ugarit, the automatic model, works very, very well with short text. So we can take your corpus entirely, we can align it, and then you can see if it works for you. If it's good, you can modify it. Of course, you can change it. And starting from that point, you can work on all of the things that you were mentioning. So extracting different types of formulae, different types of formulaic phrasal expressions, and so on. And you can also work at the lexical level. I'm assuming that there's going to be a pretty good level of lexical repetition across your corpus. So it doesn't matter that an individual text is small, as long as you can think about some patterns that are corpus-wide, right?
Amazing.
So, and by the way, the case study that I showed was not more than 100 lines. So.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and a very last remark on this, and then I will show the comments of the students. how, I mean, is it dealt in Ugarit and or in Lantpikong? How does it work for, let's say, not normalized text? So would it be possible to extract, let's say, some statistics on the instances, I don't know, of some specific graphic variants for a specific word? Yeah, because as you know, we are, I mean, these are not editions, these are let's say primary sources, so we kind of take them as they are and do not normalize them in let's say the Greek, the ancient Greek from the 5th century BC, but we leave them as they are, and it's been a desideratum of the community for so long to have like an idea more or less of these errors, graphic variants, or a specific way of writing things in the 11th, 12th century. So would it be possible?
Ugarit won't normalize anything for you. Ugarit will tokenize ancient Greek, but we can probably find a way around that if that's an issue. I don't assume that's an issue, but
no, it's even better, because I will. I mean, the real words, let's say, as they are on the source, will be taken into account, and they will not be normalized, which is not something that we want.
Right. So, but Ugarit will not apply any normalization to your text.
Perfect, amazing. Thank you so much, and I will share the comment by Jack, who is interested to hear the reason why you left off punctuation, and also another question, if not taken, don't worry, you're not taking up too much time, do not worry at all. Do either of you know of current uses of text alignment for educational methods of language teaching, e.g. Translation correction? So perhaps let's start with this one, and then let's go back to punctuation.
Megan, do you want to start?
I'd say I can definitely see the value of using text alignment in that way. I don't know of a specific case study myself, except maybe perhaps, I mean, Perseus has that really great function where, you know, if you click on a word in the corpus, it'll come up with a dictionary definition, and then also with some potential readings of how you should interpret it grammatically, which is quite helpful for learning how to read, you know, the various languages like ancient Greek and Latin, but it's not necessarily quite the same as text alignment per se.
Yes, we have used word alignment quite a lot for language teaching, and we have several schools and several partners that use Ugarit specifically for language teaching. I can't speak for them, but I've used Ugarit quite a lot in teaching Latin and ancient Greek. Without expanding more into that, we have provided a couple, I think, of readings in the further reading section that sort of explain the value, I think, and the potential applications of Ugarit for language teaching. Those are limited to classical languages, but I don't see any reason why they couldn't be expanded into something different. And then, the punctuation.
For the punctuation,
The punctuation thing, very, very briefly. The reason why we specifically left out punctuation is because in ancient Greek editions, punctuation is editorial. So it doesn't reflect something that we can, with confidence, bring back to an ideal original. The original doesn't exist, of course, we'll know that. But the punctuation is something that an editor applied to the Greek text, and it cannot be brought back to how the text was supposed to be in any way. So it's very problematic from my point of view to align punctuation or consider even punctuation. But that may not be the case for different languages.
Yeah, I would say in my case, we didn't factor in punctuation to start with, but now that we've finished the project, we're now wondering if we should have, partly because while, again, punctuation is very much an editorial issue, we're really lucky to know exactly which version of the text our translator was working with. And that text is really unusual because it was the product of a publisher who was also an editor. and sort of put out his own very unique copy of the text. And that's why we're really interested in seeing that the punctuation that editor put in does seem to have an effect on how our translator has approached it. But I'd say generally, a lot of times people overlook punctuation, which is generally valid, but there sometimes can be some really fascinating stuff going on.
That's very interesting. I mean, I might imagine that aligning the punctuation between two modern texts, let's say, two modern translations, might be like semantically more. I mean, I wouldn't say more correct, but more faithful in a way, because I mean, it is the product of an author or an editor working with his or her own language, so not superimposing another language on an ancient one, if I'm clear. But yeah, it's extremely interesting. Yeah, but thank God for my corpus, I will not have this problem. Yeah, but cool, amazing. Do we have any other question from the students and participants? Otherwise, do you, Chiara and Megan, have comments? Anything else to say to our audience?
I think I just want to bring up, I mean, you mentioned formulaic language. I think Chiara and I, both our eyes lit up slightly, because formulaic language is such an interesting thing to look at with text alignment. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting to see how translators handle the same phrase differently, or whether they handle it the same, or even if, in the case of the text I was working with, how one translator handles a repeated phrase across their translation. And that was one of the really big, exciting finds, is that Virgil sometimes repeats phrases across the Aeneid, but he does it really subtly, so it's really hard to kind of recognize when he's done it. And my mind was blown when I discovered that the translator had actually picked up on this. This medieval translator knew Virgil well enough that he was able to reproduce these repetitions within his own translation, that he was reading that closely, and he cared enough about it to put them in. And when you compare his work to later Latin translators like Dryden, you don't seem to see the same effort. And I was just, my mind was blown, because I hadn't even realized that these repetitions existed until I ran it through a computer, and it told me, it's like, oh, there are these repetitions. I was able to tell computationally. It just goes to show that the human mind is capable of great things.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, I see that in my corpus. I mean, we have some formulaic expressions, but they're not so, let's say, they're very repetitive. We have a lot, for example, Kyrie voithitos odulo, or Theotokia voithitos odulo. And also, I mean, let's stay in the English language. Some people might translate this with Mother of God help, or Virgin aid, or Virgin help. I mean, there's not a very big variety, but even with those like 4 words, you get a whole lot of solutions that are not consistent. I mean, you still understand what's going on, but it's interesting also to see like the pattern of how people are translating these actually very easy texts. But so I will definitely give it a go. So having said that, I think that we can start closing our session, and I would like to remind everybody that in 1 week, on Monday, April 22nd, we will have our 3rd session on Suda Online and Digital Suda projects by our colleagues Monica Berti from the University of Leipzig and Gabriel Godard from the University of London. So don't miss it. I hope to see many of you there. And for now, thank you, and bye-bye, everyone.